10th of March, 2025. Thinking about the matter some more, there's something I should elaborate on, or perhaps simplify. I use the word behavioral a lot, but you can just as well say psychological. You can psychologically be of a gender separate to your sex, but expressing that in an aesthetic manner, or implying that genders must be societally considered differently to one another, is doing nothing more than enforcing gender roles. I guess I am not saying that transgender people should not express their gender aesthetically. I am saying that you don't have to be of a gender to express the aesthetic that has been tied to it, and transgender exists in a lack of understanding of this. Whether you are a boy or a girl psychologically should have no weight in your place in society, just as whether you're a boy or a girl physically shouldn't. But perhaps something we should start doing is use the words psychological sex instead of gender. In this manner, gender would be of expression, it would be of aesthetics and of social considerations, and psychological sex would be of whether your psychology is that of a male or female, or between the two, under the idea that such things exist, which is strongly debatable. In this manner, I can maintain my opposition to the concept of gender while admitting that a person's psychology can be misfit to their sex, just as their physical body can be. Gender is what we should strive to abolish. It is needless aesthetic to sex and societal considerations to sex that we should not be perpetuating anymore. Our wordings have forced us to conflate the separate concepts of aesthetics and psychology into the single word that is gender, and I think it is time that we dismantle this confusion. Gender is of the social. It is artificial and arbitrary. Psychological sex is of the mind. It is an unchanging biological truth. Though, of course, with this said, we actually should be debating on whether or not there is such a thing as female and male psychology. The social condition taught behavior on its own seems already to be superior to the inherent natural psychology of sex, which makes the searching of what consists this psychology even harder. Perhaps this is a reason why I had been so intent on differentiating transgender from transsexual in my previous writings, as transsexual is the natural truth of the physical body, to which can be added the natural truth of psychology, whereas transgender is of the artificial concepts of gender that enforces gender rules and invariably tie gender to an aesthetic, for in truth, aesthetic and social considerations is all that gender is about. To decide whether or not gender should exist, we should ask ourselves two questions. The first would be the following: do females and males have a different psychology to one another? The answer is yes, and thus by this answer alone we can consider that gender should exist. But let's ask a second question. Should genders be societally considered differently to one another in spite of inherent differences? And the answer here should be no. Thus we can conclude that gender shouldn't exist, or better yet, that we should keep it distinct from psychological sex. Psychological sex is the answer to the first question. It is the true psychological differences between genders, and gender is the answer to the second question. It is a problematic and unjust difference in societal considerations based on physical and or psychological traits. Gender is unjust and it is restraining. The progressive thing to do is not to create more of them, it is to abolish the whole thing. 11th of March, 2025. Reading back yesterday's writings, I see that the words I had put in place had parallels with some I was already equipped with. What I called psychological sex and gender are truly just gender and gender expression respectively. I guess it goes to show just how much we conflate these two notions. How unfortunate. Perhaps it is overdue time for me to follow my own advice on backtracking upon opinions and staying detached from them. Time for me to look more critically at the opinions I have been arguing for thus far. Simplified to a single phrase, the opinion has been the following: gender distinct from sex perpetuates gender rules. For this I have been for the total abolition of gender, and I have remained as such even though through exploration of the topic I have realized the distinction between gender and gender expression, a perspective that thus gives validity to gender separate from expression, as one's psychology can be misfit to their sex. And this dilemma I have explored by asking the question of whether or not there actually is such a thing as male psychology and female psychology. And thus this last would seem to be the determining factor to the dilemmas above it. If male and female psychologies are sufficiently distinct from one another, then gender distinct from expression has validity. And thus concepts such as transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, demi-boy, demi-girl, and the rest have validity. But if male and female psychologies are essentially the same as one another, all of these genders lose their meanings. So thus is the ultimate question: do females and males have different psychologies to one another? The greatest problem here, the reason why I have now written 50 pages on ponderings about sexuality, is that the ultimate question does not have an ultimate answer. The answer is not completely yes, and it is not completely no. And better yet, if the answer is in fact that females and males have distinct enough psychologies, then arises new questions that we must ask. The main one being the following. Does gender imply that separate genders must be societally considered differently to one another? If yes, why, and is that a good thing? And if no, why, and is that a good thing? An inherent difficulty in understanding these matters is the fact that we currently do consider genders differently. An argument I have been giving for thus far is that genders must not be considered differently to one another, and I have argumented that this meant genders must be abolished completely. As I have stated in page 19, gender only has validity when it is not social, and gender has no function when it is not social. This is an opinion I think I must now re-explore. The proposition was that if gender is given validity by psychology, yet societally genders must still be treated the same, which I believe that they should, then gender would essentially be invisible, a matter of the mind that needs not be shared. I like this perspective, for it settles itself in the alignment of considering different psychologies to females and males, and allows for the existence of gender, while still explaining that it serves no societal function, and is entirely impractical, for gender expression must be kept distinct from gender. But of course here we come across the naive and terrible reality that is the considerations of the popular opinion, since they themselves do not expressly separate gender from gender expression. They do not see gender as something invisible and inconsequential. And so, as I stated in page 39, it fucking is about gender roles. So basically here is the summary. If male and female psychologies are too similar to each other, then gender must be abolished completely. If they have sufficient inherent differences for classification, then gender should be maintained, but should have no weight or impact in social considerations. If it had social implications, then those would be gender rules, arbitrary matters such as the idea that females need to wear dresses and males need to wear pants. Perhaps in other words, I am coming back on my opinion of abolition of gender, because I have been conflating gender and gender expression. But it is hard not to, for the people I'm arguing against, the popular opinion, also conflate gender and gender expression, and believe that gender must be societally consequential, without admitting that this is a reinforcement of gender rules. My logic is that gender should act somewhat like high-functioning autism. I do not need to say to anyone that I am autistic. It can be more or less invisible, and it certainly should not alternate the way that I am treated by my peers. I have been for abolition of gender because I was conflating gender and gender expression, but even though I do not anymore, the popular opinion still does, and so it seems easier to remain for abolition of gender rather than to specify the rules attached to it, for the popular opinion itself is not yet capable of truly making that separation. Here perhaps is the conclusion to where my opinion lies. As long as the popular opinion sees gender as something practical, or in other words, as long as they do not separate gender from gender expression, I will remain for the abolition of gender. And if someday they do make the distinction between gender and gender expression, and see gender as something completely impractical and inconsequential, then that day I will no longer be for the abolition of gender. We are not there yet. In this day and age, distinction between sex and gender exists specifically to be seen in a specific manner. Transgender girls want to be seen as girls, and transgender boys want to be seen as boys. I want to see a person, and I consider that gender is not to be seen. Transgender people do not see gender as impractical and unconsequential. They are perpetuating gender rules, and thus I am forced to this day to remain for the abolition of gender, even though it could be otherwise. 13th of March, 2025. So here I presume are the two questions we are to ask if we are to decide whether or not gender is a concept to be maintained, and neither of which have clear-cut answers. The first is, do females and males have sufficiently distinct psychologies from one another for gender to exist as a classification to them? And if yes, the second question is, does gender imply that they must be societally considered differently to one another, and what are the consequences of the answer? Perhaps my disagreement with the popular opinion lies more so with the second than with the first. One would think that attempts at being progressive would automatically imply giving same societal considerations to both genders, but clearly progressivity is not a singular thing. The large majority of transgender people answer to the first that psychology does dictate gender, and they answer to the second that genders must be societally distinct from one another. They answer so for this last because, likely more so than cisgendered people, they do want their gender to be seen. and thus they must think that it is a social matter. And for this I disagree with the popular opinion, for my belief lies in that gender must not be a social matter, under the assumption that it even exists. It is a dilemma. By accepting gender, we are allowing for concepts such as transgender, gender fluid, demi-boy or girl, and others to exist, but we're implying that genders are to be social and distinct, which is uselessly unegalitarian. And by abolishing gender, we are creating true equality between sexes, but not allowing for transgender to exist. Except, here's the thing, the reason why this last approach is so much better than the prior is that it is in fact transgender that we're forbidding and not transsexual. The freedom of what to do with one's body still remains. And better yet, bodily modifications are sufficiently logical to justify that sex has been altered. And it will in fact be a matter of nothing more than sex, for fixing how one feels within their body, and not of how they feel socially, for if we understand both genders the same, this problem would not exist. People who contest for gender and concepts such as transgender are inexorably stating that males and females must be societally considered differently to one another. If they were not, there would be no need for gender to exist. They are fighting on the side of gender division rather than against it. Perhaps there are some people who are for the maintaining of gender while still understanding the distinction between gender and gender expression, under the idea that psychology is gendered, which again is debatable. But they do not appear to be the majority. What transgender people want above anything is to be socially considered according to the constructed traits of gender, not simply understand the specific traits of their psychology. Of course, they only operate this way because the current world we live in is one of clearly divided genders. As I said in page 15, it is the necessary temporary solution. But this only holds true for transgender, not transsexual. It is not necessary, and this point in time absolutely is the time when we should renounce the gender rules. As I said in page 28, why do you feel the need to call yourself a woman to dress and act like one? To this last question, one might reply, because I do not want to just dress like a woman, I want to be a woman. And thus, in fact, by stating this, they would be admitting that genders must be societally distinct from one another. They would be perpetuating gender roles. I'm not convinced that psychology clearly correlates with gender, but even if it does, giving it any form of utilitarian function would be perpetuating gender roles. And so on this I will close. Gender only has validity when it is not social, and gender has no function when it is not social. 14th of March, 2025. What is the purpose of gender? This question must be divided into two. Is gender psychological and is gender social? Neither overwrite each other and neither have clear-cut answers. In my opinion, gender should only be maintained as a concept if the answer to the first is yes and the answer to the second no. And as I observe it, the answer to the first is maybe, and the answer to the second, for the majority of people, is yes. Thus, I believe that gender distinct from sex perpetuates gender roles. If gender was distinct from gender expression, it would not be so, and even though I now make that distinction, most in the popular opinion do not. And even if the second question was resolved and we decided to understand gender as societally inconsequential, we would still be left with the first question. And often I fail to believe that psychology correlates sufficiently with gender for this classification to be valid. One of the initial points of me writing down these matters was to try detecting my biases, and thus keep my arguments purely logical. But I have noticed that I have been less and less taking the time to analyze my biases as the writings progressed. Here is a bias that I have just noticed as I was thinking about the matter some more. I had been considering that I was wrong on the matter, that most in the popular opinion conflate gender and gender expression. Perhaps many do understand gender as societally inconsequential, perhaps even most. Yet by considering this, my mind did not automatically accord that this meant gender was valid as a concept. It immediately jumped back to question 1, is psychology sufficient for gender, and started thinking on why it may not be. So from this I can deduce that on some level I am trying to make a point and defend a single perspective, more than I am actually trying to be objective in the matter. A mental track has been shaped, leading to a conclusion, and the beginning of a new one accidentally converged with this first on its descent. This should not be the goal. Having noticed this, I will spend more time observing my biases and fighting against the natural tendencies of my mind of these shaped tracks, even if many times I will fail. If not most, for thus is the nature of a bias. It is a blind spot of the mind. Let's thus put this tool of self-criticality to the use. It may be that yes may be answer to the first question, and that psychologies do sufficiently correlate with gender, and no to the second, that gender is not social and mustn't perpetuate gender rules despite existing. If these are the answers, then I guess I'm fine with the concept of gender. I do notice that my mind is still fighting back to admit this, for it somewhat disqualifies my now 58 pages of writings on the matter, or at least a part of it. I will be thinking back on this with a clearer mind. For now, what I will say, for it still seems that I am trying to defend this case, is that both questions of psychology and sociality don't truly appear to have concise singular answers, and for this the debate is worthy to be had. Who knows, this might have been the reason why I spent so much time on the topic. Maybe it is that as soon as I was willing to confess that one of the two questions could be answered in favor of maintaining gender, I did not allow the second question to be too, in my desire of defending this opinion, even though both questions of psychology and sociality always could have been answered in favor of gender. I will have to think about this some more. 15th of March, 2025. Of course, with this said, we actually should be asking ourselves whether or not gender correlates with psychology and the way we understand it too. I hold the belief that social conditioning weighs a lot more on the shaping of behavior in psychology than the inherent psychology does. This has existed since before antiquity, this social reinforcement of what is male and what female, and in the 19th century, the social division has grown even more. But although the division is so spread in history and geography, I still believe it to be mostly artificial, an inherited ideology that, although has been useful, we do not need anymore, similarly to religion. And this is because there have been countries and there have been times where this division has not been so strong. In Celtic Ireland, for example, I understand that women had a lot of rights. In our day and age of this 21st century, it is popular culture in the form of movies and other media that are perpetuating in our minds conceptions of masculinity and femininity, especially American movies, with large muscular gun-wielding men and seducing well-dressed women with perfect bodies. It comes to the point where we are starting to forget how artificial and extreme these stereotypes are. In real life, people are not like this. The division between genders in both body and mind is truly a lot more faint. Social conditioning certainly forces men to be masculine and women to be feminine, but if it were not for social conditioning, how masculine and feminine would we truly be? Well, the thing is, we're starting to see this. This is the reason why progressist ideologies are so prevalent, because we are seeing in ourselves that we are not masculine and feminine, while not understanding that these concepts were fake since the beginning. This is why so many people are choosing specific genders, I believe, because they see that they don't fit with the social concepts of their gender and feel like that makes them different from others. With this new age of mass sharing of any possible thought and opinion thanks to the internet, cultures such as that of femboys are rising, and even straight males can be femboys, as is the case with myself. And this culture has arisen because men never were strong and masculine, and in aesthetics always have been artificial. And now that we finally have the freedom to express ourselves as such, we do. Femboy culture is incredibly progressive, because we are untangling the fictional concepts of masculinity, whereas cultures of gender, such as transgender and gender fluid, are doing nothing more than reinforcing masculinity and femininity. Femboys and tomboys are progressive, as they are no more than aesthetics and full deconstruction of gendered behavior. Transsexual is progressive, as that is of no more than the body. But anything that has to do with a gender is assuming that masculinity and femininity, as we see them in movies, are objective realities, rather than exaggerated constructs. I think that the reality of the matter is the following. Males and females do have psychologies that in some faint way are distinct from one another, but I don't think they're quite distinct enough for the separation of gender and sex to quite make sense. This separation we make because we do not distinguish gender from gender expression. I think that fundamentally behavior is not gendered, and thus any conception of gender inexorably reaffirms that masculinity and femininity exist, because by placing your gender between the two extremes, you're implying that the spectrum exists, and that the extremes are objective. You're implying that this frame of masculinity to femininity exists, and I believe that it does not. Yesterday I have heard that there is such a thing as a femboy flag, as they do with genders. To this too I want to oppose myself to. Femboy is an aesthetic and behavior, like goth and punk. It is not a gender. For this it is more progressive than gender, and I think it better to renounce to a flag to maintain this distinction. This of course is but a detail. In my rereading of today's writings, I noticed I spend the most of my time explaining why men and women must be treated the same and are essentially not that different from one another. If these incredibly fundamental matters of equality are the arguments I am to bring in the debate against gender, then it probably shows just how primal and detrimental gender truly is, despite the popular opinion's belief that they're being progressive by maintaining it. Here's the conclusion on today's writings. Any statement of gender distinct from sex, may it be transgender, demi-boy, demi-girl, gender-fluid, non-binary, or anything else, are in fact stating that gendered psychology is binary when it is not. It is presuming a spectrum between behavioral genders that is binary, continuous, and objective, when no such things exist. The spectrum is not two-dimensional, yet any proposition of gender inexorably states that it is. In reality, there is no such thing as objective masculinity and objective femininity, even though both popular culture and social conditioning have falsely taught us that there is. Non-binary has it in the very name. It presumes that gender psychology is binary, so as soon as we realize that it is not, the term ceases to be logical, and fall with it every other term that are set upon this same two-dimensional plane. Gender fluid says that gender is objective. I say that everyone's gender has always been fluid, because the way we understand gender is completely false. So, to answer the greatest question, what is the purpose of gender? Well, first we must ask if it is social. If it is, then it is needlessly perpetuating gender roles. If it is not, we ask the following question: is it psychological? And the answer is, well, yes, sort of, but it certainly isn't binary, and yet the way we use the word suggests that it is. So here is what I will end this exercise on. I am for the abolition of gender, but a large asterisk must follow the statement to specify that things are incredibly nuanced and fluctuant, and that under certain perspectives gender makes sense. But what I will have to end on still is the fact that on most perspectives, gender does not. Non-binary implies that gender is binary, which it is not. Gender fluid forgets that all gender is fluid. Pansexual means to be attracted regardless of gender, which in other words means in the possibility of being in a same-sex relationship, while not understanding that this technically applies to everyone. Every singular gender implies that gender is binary, and for this, none of them are correct. Perhaps this is the one answer I have been searching for since the beginning, the one explanation I have been searching for the words for all this time, that gender is not binary, and every gender distinct from sex necessarily imply that it is. If so, what a great note to end on. 17th of March, 2025. Learning happens in two phases: documentation and practice, discovering new information and trying to put it to use as to actually understand it properly. These writings are the latter. Even if my documentation is yet to be complete, the putting to practice the information discovered must accompany it on the journey. For this exercise has value, even if I will inevitably come back on a lot of what has been said. Here is a reply to the first video I made archiving these writings and sparking debates, titled Thinking About Sexuality, An Attempt at Nuance. February of 2025. First note, more semantic than argumentative, is that transsexual is an outdated medical term. There are some transgender people who still use the label, however it is considered derogatory by a larger majority of transgender people. It is a little similar to the word transvite, in that it assumes gender, sex, and gender expression are all the same. More importantly, I don't think gender is entirely social or distinct from sex. Obviously, I believe, as a trans girl myself, that there are two distinct terms. Even so, they are correlative, and interact in a way that I think is not addressed when people say that they are completely different. This is because I found gender to be a psychosocial phenomenon, and, unlike gender expression, not purely social. While gender expression completely changes depending on which time period or culture you look at, gender as a concept is always either binary or bimodal. It implies that there is an objective psychological foundation behind the concepts of man and woman, even if the roles those genders take on are constantly shifting. Ultimately, this is my attempt of addressing the problematic nature of gender roles without having to abolish gender entirely. Of course, as I mentioned, I am a transgender person, therefore I want to believe that there is validity being the gender I identify with, as well as having all other biases that come with being a white middle-class American. Hello, thank you so much for the reply. I sort of forgot I had posted this video. I thought about the subject a lot more since then, and I found that my opinion lies more so on that abolition of gender might be the better solution for society on the long term. But this is because I understand gender as being purely social, but I see that you're suggesting it to be phenomenological. I will be thinking about this. Thank you for contributing. March 2025. Hello again. If you don't want to reply to this comment, feel free not to. I realize that there's something you said that I have come to disagree with. I think that, unlike what popular culture and social conditioning have taught us, gender actually isn't binary. I don't think there's objective masculinity and objective femininity, yet every gender distinct from sex necessarily implies that there is. They imply a linear spectrum between gender psychology that I think has never actually existed. This is the matter I'm currently pondering about. Don't quite know what to do with this information, or if it even makes sense. 17th of March, 2025. So this is now the next thing for me to explore. If any gender separate to sex exists, it necessarily implies a spectrum of gender, and thus imply objective femininity and masculinity. So here's the question. Is there such a thing as objective femininity and objective masculinity? To answer this question, let's do a mental exercise. Let's take every human male and every human female and observe one group from the other. Do they present different characteristics? The answer is yes. Alright, but now let's remove from our two groups two things. Let's remove social conditioning and let's remove hormones. For gender distinct from sex, in fact, desires to be distinct from sex. It wants itself to be unchanging, despite which hormone the body possesses. So now, do our males and females have different traits to each other despite not being socially conditioned and despite not having any hormones? Well, this is the great question, isn't it? For if they do, there is such a thing as objective masculinity and objective femininity, and thus gender is valid as a concept. But if they do not, then it cannot. We can only make suppositions on what the answer may be. I tend to believe that in this scenario, the psychology of males and females would be the same as each other, and one of the reasons why I do is because of children. Children do not have hormones, so that problem is resolved, and only is left the matter of social conditioning. And the truth is, boys and girls act the same as each other, and in children where social conditioning is somewhat absent, we observe that they have the same interests and behaviors as each other. Maybe in our two groups, certain psychological characteristics appear more so in one sex than in the other. But is this a sufficient categorization method to suggest that those traits are inherent to them? Both males and females have same psychological traits, but is observing that some traits are amplified in one group sufficient to say that those traits have an automatic correlation with the group? Gender distinct from sex imply a spectrum. May it be binary or trinary, it is a spectrum nonetheless. And thus, for the spectrum to exist at all, there must be on both sides objective masculinity and objective femininity. If there is no such thing as objective masculinity and objective femininity, every one of the 72 genders put in place by the self-proclaimed progressist ideologies fall apart. In fact, it would not just be that they would not have meaning anymore, it would be that they themselves would be responsible for perpetuating gender roles, for attributing to masculinity and femininity differences that don't actually exist. The popular opinion thinks itself progressive, but it is not, for it argues that gender is singular and concise and precise and unchanging and unfluctuant. It says that man and woman are singular things with singular traits, and that those traits do not change. These are gender rules. These are considerations forced upon a sex, despite the fact that the sex will not always withhold the presumed traits. Yet gender as a spectrum, or in other words, gender distinct from sex, will necessarily apply these arbitrary traits to man and woman for the spectrum to be valid. Here we have a large board with all 72 genders suggested by the popular opinion. On the extremities, we have boy and girl, and all the traits presumed belonging to them. But now, if we understand that masculinity and femininity are not objective terms, and are willing to demonstrate the true fluctuant nature of gendered psychology, we pour out of the board boy or girl, and immediately fall with it in a shambling mess of scattered pieces all other 71 genders. For boy and girl were the frame of reference from which they wished to derive. So as soon as we realized that this frame of reference actually was not singular and unfluctuant, the pieces that clung on to this frame, to this spectrum, ceased to be logical at all. You cannot make a singular byproduct out of something that itself was not singular and actually included the byproduct in its vagueness since the beginning. It is funny, actually. We're doing the opposite with a gender than we were doing with autism. We no longer use singular and precise terms such as Asperger's, since psychology is too vague for singular classification and the autism spectrum can be kept large. Whereas with gender, the popular opinion renounces to admit that gender is not singular and have fabricated an artificial frame of genders in this confusion, not even realizing that they're perpetuating gender roles and are doing so, for they are keeping in the notion of masculinity and femininity, traits that should long have been blurred and detached. In our two-group experiment of males and females without hormones or social conditioning, we either would be left with no difference in psychology between the two groups, or some group having more specific traits than others. But if so, are those traits indicator of gender? Well, I suggest that no, or that this is too vague for an argument, for not everyone, and not even the near majority, will be equipped with those traits, and thus it may be correlative with gender while still not being an indicator for it, or even a clear consequence. Because again, here's the conclusion: gender psychology is vague and unfixed, it is not singular, and thus every singular gender set between this makeshift spectrum cannot logically make sense. It fails on the logic perspective, for it falsely presumes that masculinity and femininity are objective, and it fails on the progressive perspective, for it is in fact perpetuating gender roles. Everyone is non-binary, for gender has never been binary. Everyone is gender fluid, for gender has always been fluid. It has never been singular, and saying that it is would be to attach to male and female arbitrary traits, and worse, social traits, that would presume both male and female must be societally considered differently from each other. These are gender roles. These are what we're striving to abolish before gender became something to choose. Every gender distinct from sex imply objectivity and femininity and masculinity. And for this, none of them are correct. 22nd of March, 2025. Femboy and trans girl is the same thing, except that one says the truth about their body and the other doesn't. One dismantles gender roles and the other perpetuates it. One does not correlate aesthetic to sex and the other does. One is not of gender and does not consider masculinity and femininity to be objective. The other is of gender, and the automatic assumption that masculinity and femininity are objective that comes with it, the pretense for their conservative vision to make any sense. Femboys and tomboys are progressive. They are fashions that annihilate gender. Transgender is conservative, in the sense that it associates to sex roles and aesthetics that should long have been detached. March 2025. I don't understand transgender because I don't understand why it would have any importance what your gender is. If gender distinct from sex had any sort of social manifestation, those would be gender rules. We should have been beyond that by now. As I stated in the Sex of February, what is the point of categorizing gender if gender rules don't exist anymore? Why would anyone care about their gender? Why would it matter? Gender only has validity when it is not social, and gender has no function when it is not social. If you say you want to be seen like a boy, then you are inexorably stating that boys are to be seen differently than girls. Transgender people will play the martyr and act repressed, even though they are the ones plaguing society with conservative ideologies of gender. You are the ones being conservative here, and you fail to understand it. So with transgender not making sense on the psychological level, since there is no such thing as objective masculinity and objective femininity, and not making sense on the social level, since it is needlessly perpetuating gender roles, we are left with no reason for which transgender should actually exist. April 24th, 2025. Most people use the word transgender in replacement to transsexual. I do not. I use both words in different manners. I approve of transsexual because it leans against biological reasoning, and I disapprove of transgender because I disapprove of the concept of gender. I'm making sure here to say approve and disapprove instead of saying that I am for or against. These are in fact matters of opinion. It is complicated to separate gender from gender roles. A valid argument for gender is that it superimposes a psychological pattern, and that thus gender can be correlated to this pattern of the mind instead of physiology. But remains that not all males who think and act like females want to be females, and thus it was decided that gender is of choosing. But what does an individual take in consideration to decide upon a gender? They decide upon gender roles. Gender roles is what pushes to transition or not to. The psychological element can still coexist, but it is not the drive. And so here we have a dyslogic triangle that collapses upon itself, a three-step oxymoron. The psychology is the excuse for transition, but individuals may not want to be assigned a new gender or may want to be assigned to a new gender without the correlating psychology, and thus the choice is formed upon gender rules, social matters fixed to conservative perceptions of gender instead of the psychological element, whom was what the excuse was built upon. The psychology is the argument for gender distinct from sex, but the choosing of gender does not rest upon psychology. It rests upon the idea that males wear pants and females wear dresses, that males must be tough and stoic and females emotional, that males like sports and females like cooking. For the most part, these are social constructs, and very detrimental ones in that. And those who fight for the acceptance of gender distinct from sex inexorably embrace these conservative ideologies instead of going against them. When I say that I disapprove of transgender, I am not being the conservative one. It is those who disagree who are.